They banished her to the frozen north, never expecting the Duke to claim her. The letter was already sealed before Mara had even been told what it said. She found out the way she found out most things in the Voss household, not from her father, not from her sister, but from the housekeeper, old Dora, who pressed her lips together and said nothing, but whose eyes said everything when she brought Mara's morning tea and set it down just a little too carefully on the table. "What has happened?" Mara asked. Dora looked at the window. "Your father wishes to see you after breakfast." That was all, but Mara did not finish her tea. Her father, Edmund Voss, was a man who had built his merchant trading business on two things: numbers and appearances. He was good with numbers. He was better with appearances. He had navigated the social currents of Aldenmere for 30 years by knowing exactly how things looked, who was watching, and what a person had to sacrifice to keep a good name in a city that fed on gossip the way it fed on bread, daily and without mercy. When Mara walked into his study that morning, she already knew from the way he stood, facing the window, hands behind his back, that whatever was coming, he had already decided it. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He did not turn around right away. He looked out at the gray morning sky over Aldenmere, at the rows of chimneys and tile rooftops, at the city he had spent his life trying to impress. Then he turned, and she saw his face, and she understood that this was not going to be a conversation. It was going to be a verdict. "There was an incident at the Hargrove reception," he said. Mara said nothing. She knew which incident he meant. 3 nights ago, at Lord Aldrich Crane's pre-wedding gathering, the grandest social event of the season, attended by every notable family in the capital, she had been standing near the East Terrace doors when Lord Crane himself had approached her with a question about a shipping ledger. She had been the one to find the error the week before, buried in a column of figures her father had not bothered to check. Lord Crane had wanted to understand it. They had spoken for perhaps 10 minutes. She had explained the discrepancy clearly. He had thanked her and left. That was all. Or at least, that was all that had actually happened. Cecilia was distressed, her father said. Mara kept her hands still in her lap. Cecilia was Edmund's eldest daughter, his favorite in the way that golden things are always someone's favorite, and the woman who was scheduled to marry Lord Crane in 6 weeks. Cecilia was beautiful and charming and entirely accustomed to being the most noticed person in any room she entered. She was also, Mara had known since childhood, capable of believing whatever version of a story best served her. "I spoke with Lord Crane about a ledger error," Mara said. "He approached me. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, and was entirely about shipping figures." That is not what Cecilia saw. Then Cecilia did not see clearly. Her father's expression shifted. Not angry exactly, but harder, the way a man's face goes hard when he has made a decision and does not want it questioned. "She said you sought him out. She said you were laughing together. She said you touched his arm." "None of that is true. Mara, he said her name the way people say the name of something they are putting down. It does not matter what is true. Do you understand? It matters what people believe. Crane's family is everything to us right now. This match is everything. If there is any shadow, any suggestion, that you were attempting to—" "I was not attempting anything. That is beside the point." She looked at him steadily. She had her mother's eyes, dark and calm, with a stillness in them that people sometimes found unsettling, because they could not tell if it was patience or judgment. Perhaps it was both. "What are you going to do?" she asked. He told her. She was to leave Aldenmere within the week. She would travel north, far north, to Vorheim, where her father's estranged brother Peter ran a trade post that had been failing for years. She would stay there, help Peter with his accounts, and remain absent from the capital for as long as was necessary to allow Cecilia's wedding to proceed without any further complications. "How long?" Mara asked. "As long as necessary," her father said. "And if I refuse?" He looked at her then, with something she had not expected. Not cruelty, but a kind of tired resignation that was almost worse. "Then I will tell Crane's family that you are unwell and require care. They will draw their own conclusions. Your name will be discussed in ways that are far less recoverable." So that was the choice. Leave quietly and disappear, or stay and be made into a story that would follow her forever. Mara sat with that for a moment. She thought about her mother, who had died 4 years ago and who had loved Edmund Voss with a loyalty he had never quite deserved. She thought about all the evenings she had spent in the Voss household doing work her father did not want to do, writing letters, checking figures, meeting with suppliers, while Edmund attended dinners he considered more important. She thought about Cecilia, who had never once thanked her for anything, and who had now, with a few whispered words at a party, undone everything. "I will need more than 20 coins," Mara said. Her father blinked. It was not the response he had expected. "For the journey," she added. "And for whatever the post needs when I arrive. If Peter's accounts are in as poor a state as you say, I will need supplies, books, paper." He stared at her for a long moment. Then, quietly, he said he would arrange 50 coins and a hired escort as far as the northern road. She thanked him. She stood. She left the room without looking back, and she did not let herself feel what she was actually feeling, until she was safely behind the door of her own bedroom, with her back pressed against the cold wood. Then she let herself feel it. She did not weep for long. She had never been a woman who gave much time to weeping, not because she was hard, but because she had found early in life that tears solved very little, and that the energy spent on them was energy that could go somewhere more useful. She allowed herself perhaps 10 minutes. Then she wiped her face, sat at her desk, and began to write a list of what she would need to bring. The escort left 2 days into the journey. He was a hired man named Walter, taciturn and smelling of old leather, who had been paid in advance by Edmund and who, apparently, had decided that the advance was sufficient and that accompanying a young woman to the frozen north was more trouble than he had agreed to. He was gone when she woke on the second morning, along with one of the 2 horses and half the food. Mara sat in the cold of the roadside shelter for a long while, looking at what remained. 1 horse. 15 coins. She had kept the rest in a separate pouch inside her coat, which Walter had either not found or not bothered to take. Some dried food, her travel bag, the books and ledger paper she had insisted on bringing. She could turn around. The road back to Aldenmere was still visible from where she sat. She could return to her father and tell him the escort had abandoned her and that she would not continue. He would be angry, but he would deal with it. She thought about walking back into that house, about Cecilia's satisfied smile, about the story she would become, the difficult daughter, the one who couldn't even manage a simple journey north without making a scene. She packed what remained, got onto the horse, and continued north. Vorheim arrived like a punishment made physical. The settlement sat at the base of a granite ridge, a cluster of low stone buildings half buried in snow, smoke rising from chimneys and thin, tired columns. The sky above it was the color of old iron. The wind that came down from the ridge was the kind of cold that did not ask permission. It simply entered, through coats and scarves and skin, right down to something that felt like the center of a person. Mara arrived on a late afternoon in early winter, her fingers too stiff to properly hold the reins, her face scoured red by the wind. She had ridden the last 3 days alone. She had eaten sparingly. She had slept in roadside shelters and once in a barn whose owner had looked at her with wary suspicion before deciding, apparently, that she was too cold and too determined to be a threat. Nobody came out to meet her in Vorheim. She found the trade post herself, the largest of the stone buildings, with a faded sign above the door that said Voss Northern Trading, in letters that had been painted some years ago, and had since mostly given up. She pushed the door open. The inside was dim and smelled of old wood and something slightly damp. There were shelves along the walls, half-stocked with goods that looked like they had been sitting there since the previous season. A fire burned low in the grate. Behind a counter at the back of the room stood a man she recognized from the one time she had met him, 15 years ago at her mother's funeral. Peter Voss. He was older than she remembered, thinner too, and gray in a way that seemed to go beyond his hair. He looked at her as she pushed the door closed against the wind behind her, and his expression did not move. "Edmund sent you," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," said Mara. He could not be bothered to come himself. "No?" Peter looked her over, the way a man looks at something he has been given that he did not ask for and is not sure he wants. Then he turned and disappeared through a door at the back of the counter. "Storage room at the end of the hall," he called back. "You can sleep there. Supper is at 6. If you want to be useful, the account books are on the left shelf, and they are a complete disaster." Mara stood in the cold, half-dark trade post for a moment. She looked at the shelves. She looked at the fire, which needed more wood. She looked at the left shelf, where 3 ledgers sat in a tilted row, their spines creased and worn. She took off her coat, laid it over the counter, and went to look at the books. She found 17 separate errors in the first ledger before supper. 3 of them were significant enough to explain, on their own, why Peter Voss had been losing money for the last 2 years. She marked each one with a neat line in pencil, wrote her notes in the margins in small, clear script, and set the ledger on the counter with a strip of paper marking the first error. When Peter came back into the room, he saw what she had done. He picked up the ledger. He read her notes. His expression did not change, but something behind it did. Something shifted very slightly, like a door that has been locked for a long time, giving just a little under pressure. He set the ledger down. "Supper is ready," he said. Mara followed him through the back door. That was how it began. Not with welcome, not with kindness, not with anything that could be called warmth. It began with a cold room, an old man who did not want her there, a shelf of broken accounts, and a young woman who pulled off her coat and started working. She had been sent to the frozen north to disappear. What no one in Aldenmere had thought to consider was what she might become once she got there. Vorheim in winter was not a place that forgave weakness, and in that way, at least, it was honest. Mara had grown up in Aldenmere, where softness was covered over with silk and conversation, where the coldest things in a room were usually the people rather than the air. In Aldenmere, a woman who was too sharp was managed. She was given something small to do, or given a husband, or given a story to fit into, that kept her from taking up too much space. Mara had spent 26 years navigating that city, and she had become very good at knowing when she was being reduced. Vorheim did not reduce her. It was too busy surviving to bother. The first weeks were brutal in a way that was almost clarifying. Her room at the back of the trade post was small and unheated, and she learned quickly to sleep in her traveling coat with an extra blanket Peter gave her without comment. She learned how to bank the fire correctly so the main room would still be warm by morning. She learned that the well at the edge of the settlement had to be drawn from before midday because after that the rope would freeze in the iron ring. She learned these things by making mistakes once and then not making them again. She also learned the books. The state of Peter's accounts was not simply a matter of errors, though there were plenty of those. The deeper problem was structural. He had been running the trade post on the assumption that the southern supply routes would remain stable and the northern buyers would remain loyal, and over the last 3 years, both of those assumptions had quietly come apart. The supply costs had risen. The local fishing and trapping families who used to trade regularly through his post had started dealing directly with traveling merchants who came through Vorheim twice a year and offered better prices for their goods. Mara saw all of this in the books within the first 10 days. She also saw something else, a gap. A significant, entirely untapped market sitting in the space between what Vorheim produced and what Aldenmere desperately needed. She brought it to Peter on a Thursday evening, sitting across from him at the small table in the back room where they ate their meals in a silence that had slowly, over the weeks, become less unfriendly. She laid out 3 pages of notes and a map she had drawn from memory. Aldenmere has a shortage of cold preserved medicinal moss, she said. The kind that grows in the ridge crevices north of here. The city apothecaries pay very well for it because their southern suppliers can't keep it fresh long enough for the journey. We are 32 days closer. If we preserve it correctly and move it in sealed crates in winter, when the cold does the work for us, we can deliver it fresh and charge nearly double what the southern suppliers charge. Peter looked at the pages. He looked at the map. He turned one of the pages over and read the figures on the back. "Where did you get the apothecary pricing?" he asked. "I wrote to 3 of them," she said. "Before I left Aldenmere, I suspected there might be something like this, so I asked." He was quiet for a long moment. "You had no idea what Vorheim was like," he said. "You wrote those letters before you left, without knowing if there was any moss at all." "I knew the ridge terrain from maps. I knew the climate. I made an educated guess." Another silence. The fire popped. "And the crates?" he said. "The carpenter on the east side of the settlement. His name is Bart. I have spoken with him twice. He can build them. He needs winter work. He will do it at a reasonable cost." Peter folded his hands on the table. He looked at her across the small space between them, and for the first time since her arrival, his expression held something that was not simply tired neutrality. "Your father told me you were sent here to be out of the way," he said. Mara met his eyes. "Yes. He made it sound like you had done something. I spoke to a man about a ledger error at a party. My sister decided that was a reason to have me removed." Peter absorbed this. He had not asked before. She had not offered it. But now it sat between them, plain and clean, and she watched him turn it over in his mind. "Edmund always was afraid of things he didn't understand," he said finally. He picked up the first page of her notes and looked at it again. "I will speak to Bart tomorrow." That was the beginning of the real work. Over the following weeks, as the deep winter settled fully over Vorheim, and the days shortened to a mere handful of pale hours, Mara began to understand the settlement in ways that the books had not been able to show her. She understood it through people. There was Bart, the carpenter, who was 50 years old and had lived in Vorheim his entire life, and who knew every family and every building in the settlement the way a person knows their own hands. He talked while he worked, and Mara listened, and through him she began to learn the invisible map of Vorheim, who trusted whom, who was struggling, what the settlement had once been, and what it had slowly become. There was Clara, the healer, who worked out of a low building near the chapel, and who had almost no medical supplies because the cost of importing them from the south had become too high. Clara was a practical woman in her mid-40s who made do with what grew near the ridge in summer, and what she could barter from traders who passed through. She had a deep, quiet competence that Mara recognized immediately, and they became, if not friends exactly, then something close to it. Two women who respected each other's ability to get things done. There was the Holst family, who fished the river that ran east of the settlement, and who lost a significant portion of their catch every season because their preservation method was outdated. Mara looked at what they were doing one afternoon when she followed young Ned Holst down to the river out of curiosity, and she recognized the problem within an hour. A simple change in the salting process and the timing of the packing would cut their losses by almost half. She told Ned, who told his father, who tried it, and who appeared at the trade post 2 weeks later with a crate of preserved fish and an expression that sat somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. Word moved quickly in a small settlement. By midwinter, people had begun to come to the trade post, not just to buy and sell goods, but to find Mara. Someone's contract with a traveling merchant needed looking at. Someone's family in the south owed them money and had not paid. Someone wanted to know if there was a better way to time the selling of their goods to get a higher price. Mara helped when she could. She asked for nothing in return, at first. But the people of Vorheim did not take help without giving something back. That was simply not how things worked in a settlement where survival depended on everyone pulling their weight. She received firewood, preserved food, knitting lessons from old Marta Greer that she did not particularly want but accepted gracefully, because Marta had needed someone to sit with since her husband had died in the autumn. Peter watched all of this from the edges. He said very little about it. But the trade post began to change around her presence, quietly, without announcement. The shelves were better stocked. The accounts no longer bled red. The first shipment of preserved medicinal moss went south in sealed crates in late January, and the payment that came back was larger than Peter had earned in the previous 3 months combined. He told her, on the evening the payment arrived, that she was better at this than he had ever been. She said nothing for a moment. "You are good at it too," she said finally. "You simply lost the belief that you could be. That is different from lacking the ability." He looked at her. Something crossed his face, not quite emotion, but the shadow of emotion, like light moving behind a curtain. "Edmund told me you were quiet," he said, unassuming. Mara almost smiled. Edmund sees what he expects to see. Through all of it, she did not allow herself to feel settled. She knew this was not permanent. She knew Aldenmuir existed, that Cecilia's wedding had taken place. She had received a brief, formal note from her father confirming it, with no other content, and that at some point she would be expected to do something, though what, exactly, she was not sure. Her father had said as long as necessary, which was not a time frame, which meant it was a door she could not see the end of. She kept herself from thinking about it too directly, the way you keep yourself from pressing on a bruise. She focused on what was in front of her, the books, the people, the cold. She was not happy in the simple, uncomplicated way that word usually implies, but she was something she had not been in Aldenmuir in a very long time, genuinely useful, genuinely seen, and genuinely free from the constant low-level pressure of managing how she appeared to people who did not actually care about her. The settlement was beginning to trust her, and she was beginning, cautiously, to trust it back. Then the Duke of Norfeld arrived, and everything changed again. He came on a morning in February, when the sky was so white it was almost blinding. She heard the horses first, more than 2, she noted, which meant it was someone who traveled with attendants, which meant it was someone with authority. She was in the back of the trade post when Peter knocked on the door and said, without inflection, that they had visitors. She came out to the front of the post and saw him standing in the middle of the main room, with 2 men behind him, and snow still on the shoulders of his coat. He was tall, taller than she had expected from the description she had since pieced together, and he held himself with the particular stillness of a man who had learned that he did not need to take up space to command it. He was looking at the shelves when she came in. Then he looked at her. "You are Mara Voss?" he said. "I am," she said. "I am Evander Stroh," he said, "Duke of Norfeld. I believe some of these northern territories fall under my governance. I have come to understand why my trade revenues from this region have been declining for the past 4 years, and why, in the last 6 weeks, they appear to have turned around." Mara looked at him for a moment. "The ledgers are on the left shelf," she said. "I can explain the figures whenever you are ready." Something in his expression shifted, barely, but she caught it. He was ready, he said, immediately. The ledgers were spread across every available surface in the back room, and Evander Stroh stood very still at the center of it all, looking at them the way a man looks at a map of territory he thought he knew. He had arrived expecting disorder. He had arrived expecting the kind of failure that explained itself through incompetence or laziness, two things he had seen plenty of in his years managing the Northern Territories, and two things he knew how to deal with. He had not expected precision. He had not expected color-coded margin notes in a hand so clear it read almost like print. He had not expected to stand in the back room of a failing trade post at the edge of the known world and find what amounted to a complete economic analysis of everything that had gone wrong and everything that could go right. "This notation here," he said, pointing to a column on the second ledger. "You've identified a 6-week lag between the northern harvest cycle and the southern import cycle." "Yes," said Mara. "The traders who come through Vorheim twice a year time their visits to coincide with their own southern routes, which means they arrive too early for the full summer harvest and too late for the winter trapping season. The Vorheim families sell at the wrong time because they have no other choice. If there were a way to hold goods, proper cold storage, which the northern climate makes relatively simple, they could wait for a better time to sell." Evander looked at her. "You have been here 6 weeks. 7, she said. "In 7 weeks you identified this. The information was in the books, it just needed to be organized." He was quiet for a moment. His 2 attendants stood near the door to the back room, and Peter hovered somewhere in the vicinity of the far wall, a man who had understood within about 4 minutes of Evander's arrival that this was not a conversation he was going to lead. "The medicinal moss shipment," Evander said. "That was your idea." Peter approved it. "But it was your idea." She looked at him steadily. "Yes. Where did the apothecary contacts come from?" "I wrote to them before I left Aldenmere. I anticipated there might be something worth shipping." He studied her with an attention that was not rude and not warm. It was simply very thorough, the way a person looks at something they are genuinely trying to understand. "Who sent you here?" he asked. There was a brief pause. Not a guilty pause, not a frightened one, simply the pause of a person deciding how much of the truth to offer. "My father," she said. "Edmund Voss. He is a merchant in the capital." "Why?" Another pause. She had found, since arriving in Vorheim, that this question came up less than she had expected. People here were too occupied with practical things to spend much time on the politics of why a person had ended up in their settlement. But Evander Stroh was not a man asking out of idle curiosity. He asked the way he did everything she was already learning, with a particular, direct intention. "My sister was about to marry Lord Aldrich Crane," she said. "My presence at a pre-wedding event was misinterpreted. My father decided it was simpler to send me away than to correct the misinterpretation." Evander looked at her for a long moment. "Simpler for whom?" he said. She almost smiled. "Not for me." He said nothing to that. He turned back to the ledgers and asked her to walk him through the full reconciliation she had done on the 4th book, the one covering the last 18 months of transactions. She did. It took the better part of 2 hours. He asked questions, not many, but each one precisely targeted at the things she had been most uncertain about herself, which told her something about how his mind worked. By the time they finished, the afternoon light had thinned to almost nothing outside the single small window of the back room, and Dora, who had no Dora here, only the settlement's informal arrangement where Clara brought food to the trade post on the days Peter forgot to cook, had left a pot of something warm on the shelf outside the door. Evander's attendants had long since retreated to wherever they were lodging for the night. It was only the 3 of them now, Evander, Mara, and Peter, who had fallen asleep in his chair near the fire about an hour ago with the quiet indifference of a man who had decided that whatever was happening was above his management. Evander looked at the sleeping Peter, then he looked at Mara. "You are keeping this place alive," he said. It was not a question, and it was not a compliment. It was an observation, delivered with the same directness he brought to everything. "The place was not beyond saving," she said. "It only needed someone to look at it properly. And before you arrived, no one did. Peter did his best. He simply did it alone for too long. He considered this. You defend him." "I describe him accurately," she said. "He is not incompetent. He was overwhelmed and underfunded, and he had no one to share the work with. Those are different problems from incompetence." Evander looked at her across the cluttered table of ledgers, and for the first time since his arrival, something in his expression changed in a way she could not entirely define. It was not softness. She did not think this was a man who went easily to softness. It was something more like recognition. "I am going to stay in Vorheim for the rest of the week," he said. "I need to understand the full state of my northern territories, and the information I need is here." "I can prepare a summary," she said. "I would prefer the full explanation," he said, "from you, if you are willing." She nodded. He stood, gathering his notes. At the door of the back room, he paused without turning fully around. The 6-week lag, he said. Your solution was cold storage. What would the cost of building it be? She had, in fact, already worked this out. She quoted him the figure. He was quiet for a moment. And the return on investment? She quoted him that too. He nodded once, and left. She sat at the table for a moment after he was gone, surrounded by the ledgers that had become, over the past weeks, as familiar to her as the lines of her own handwriting. Outside the small window, the night had settled fully over Vorheim, and the cold pressed in at the edges of the glass, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the wind moving through the ridge above the settlement. She was not sure what to make of Evander Stroh. She had met powerful men before. Her father was one. Aldrich Crane was one. The various merchants and officials who had passed through the Voss household were many. They all had a certain quality in common. An assumption. An assumption that their presence shaped the room, that their needs organized the space around them, that other people's purpose was to arrange themselves in relation to what they required. Evander did not have that assumption, or if he had it, he wore it so lightly that it did not press on the room the way those other men's had. He had sat in this back room and looked at her ledgers and asked her questions, and listened to her answers without a single moment of surprise that she had the answers, or impatience when she gave them in full, or the particular half-attention of a man who is listening only enough to decide when it is his turn to speak. He had simply listened, and then he had asked another question. She picked up her pencil and turned back to the page she had been working on before he arrived. There was more to do. There was always more to do. But she found, as she bent over the figures, that her mind would not quite settle the way it usually did. She made herself focus. Numbers did not rearrange themselves to suit a person's distraction. The week Evander stayed in Vorheim turned into 10 days without announcement or explanation. He appeared each morning at the trade post and they worked through the documents together. First the Vorheim records, then the broader territorial figures he had brought with him, which told a story across the whole of the northern region that was in many ways more troubling than what she had found in Peter's books. The northern territories had been managed from a distance for too long. Policies set in Aldenmere had been designed for the south and applied to the north without adjustment. Supply chain assumptions were wrong. Tax assessment figures were based on outdated population counts. Infrastructure decisions had been made without anyone spending actual time in the region to understand what the region actually needed. Mara said none of this to Evander directly. She simply laid out the data and let the data say it. He saw it clearly. She could tell by the way his note-taking changed over the days, becoming more specific, more pointed, moving from the general to the particular with the efficiency of a man who had decided what he thought and was now deciding what to do about it. They did not talk about anything other than the work, at first. On the 8th day, it changed. They had finished for the afternoon and she was returning the last of the ledgers to their shelf when he said, without looking up from the page he was reviewing, "How long do you intend to stay in Vorheim?" She paused. "I am not certain. My father said as long as necessary. He has not defined necessary." "Do you want to go back?" She was quiet for a moment. It was not a question she had let herself consider directly. "There is nothing in Aldenmere that requires my return," she said carefully. "That is not what I asked." She turned from the shelf and looked at him. He had set down his pen and was looking at her with the same direct attention he brought to everything. "No," she said. "I do not think I want to go back to what it was. Not the way it was." He nodded as if this confirmed something he had already understood. Then he looked back at his page. "The cold storage," he said. "I have decided to fund the construction. I am also going to petition to adjust the supply route timing for this region. It will take time, but the figures support it clearly." "They do," she agreed. "I am going to note in my report to the capital that the recent stabilization of the Vorheim post is attributable to management changes initiated in the past 2 months." She looked at him. "I am not going to name you," he added, "unless you wish me to." She understood what he was offering. Acknowledgement, or discretion, whichever she preferred. She thought about it. "Name Peter," she said. "He is the one who approved the changes, and he will need the credit when he deals with the capital going forward." Evander looked at her for a long moment. "You could use the credit," he said. "Peter needs it more," she said. He said nothing, but when he left Vorheim 2 days later, he took with him a complete set of her analyses, bound and labeled in her handwriting, and when he shook Peter's hand at the door of the trade post, he spoke a few words quietly in the old man's ear that she could not hear. Whatever it was, it made Peter stand straighter. To her, Evander said only, "I will be in contact about the cold storage construction." She nodded. He left. His horses disappeared up the road north of the settlement, and the sound of them faded into the white distance. Mara stood outside the trade post door for a moment, the cold settling around her shoulders. She went back inside and picked up her pencil. The letter from Cecilia arrived on a Tuesday, which was also the day the cold storage construction began. The timing was almost poetic, Mara thought, in the grim way that only real life manages. One thing being built while another tried to call you back to the rubble of the past. She read the letter at the trade post counter while outside the window she could hear Bart and his two helpers breaking ground on the stone foundation, their tools ringing against the frozen earth with a sound like something being made real. Cecilia had always written in a particular way. Her letters had the shape of warmth without the substance of it, the words in the right places, the affectionate opening, the carefully neutral phrasing, and underneath all of it, the actual point, which arrived late in the letter like a bill folded inside a greeting. The wedding, Cecilia wrote, had not gone entirely to plan. Lord Crane's finances had been reviewed during the premarital settlement process, and certain irregularities had been found. Not criminal, she was careful to say, but troubling. The Crane family name, which had been so glittering and certain 6 months ago, had become somewhat less certain. The Voss family's association with it was not what it had seemed. Cecilia needed Mara to come home. Not come home exactly. She did not say that directly. She said that the family would benefit from Mara's presence. She said that Mara had connections now, in the north, that might be valuable. She said that she hoped Mara understood what the family needed, and that she would act accordingly. Mara set the letter down on the counter. She had spent weeks preparing herself for the possibility that something would come from home. She had thought about what she would feel. She had expected anger, or hurt, or perhaps the complicated ache of wanting, despite everything, to be needed by the people who had sent her away. What she felt, reading Cecilia's letter, was none of those things. She felt tired, a clean, clear tiredness, like the feeling of having put down something heavy. She folded the letter neatly and set it on the shelf under the counter where she kept documents that needed no immediate action. Then she went back to the ledger she had been updating before the postwriter arrived, and she worked until the light changed outside and Bart called through the door that the foundation's first course was laid. She went out to look at it. The stones sat in a clean row in the frozen ground, gray and solid and real. "Good work," she said. Bart grinned. "By summer, it will be finished. Your Duke knows how to move money when he decides to." "He is not my Duke," she said. Bart's grin did not change. He was not a man who adjusted his opinions based on mild corrections. She was inside again, at the counter, when she heard the horses. She had learned, over the months in Vorheim, to identify arrivals by sound before she saw them. One horse, light and fast, was a post rider or a scout. 2 horses, steady-paced, was a merchant or traveler. 3 or more, with a particular evenness to the gait, was someone who kept good horses and knew how to manage them on difficult terrain. This was the third kind. She heard the door before she had time to consider it, and then Evander Stroh was standing in the trade post for the second time, snow on his shoulders, his 2 attendants behind him, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, not the professional attention of their first meeting, not the studied neutrality he wore through most of their working sessions. Something more direct than that, more deliberate. "You are here early," she said. "The cold storage is only at foundation stage." "I did not come about the cold storage," he said. She waited. "I have been in Aldenmere," he said. Something shifted in the room, not visibly. Nothing in the space between them changed. But something shifted, the way the air shifts before a change in weather, when the pressure has been building and you can feel it before anything moves. "I see," she said. He had placed his gloves on the counter, a gesture she had learned to read as the sign that he intended to stay long enough to say something that required settling in for. "I spent 3 weeks there," he said. "I had business with the Capital Authority regarding the Northern Territory restructuring. I also made some inquiries." "About me," she said. It was not a question. "About the events that led to your departure," he said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The fire behind her crackled. Outside, she could hear Bart's tools ringing against the stone. "You did not ask me first," she said. "No," he said. "I did not. I am telling you now." It was not an apology exactly. It was honesty, the same quality he brought to everything, including the things that were difficult. She had learned, over the weeks of working with him, that he did not smooth things over. He set them down, clearly and plainly, and waited. "What did you find?" she asked. He told her, all of it. He had spoken with people at the Merchant Guild who had been present at the Hargrove reception, and who had seen the 10-minute conversation between Mara and Lord Crane for exactly what it was. He had spoken with a woman named Helen, who had been a maid in the Voss household and who had witnessed Cecilia's deliberate construction of the accusation the morning after the reception. He had spoken with Crane himself, who was by now deeply unhappy with his association with the Voss family, and had been surprisingly willing to confirm the full truth of the evening. He laid all of this out in front of her the way he laid out ledger figures, clearly, systematically, without embellishment. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Why did you do this?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Because what was done to you was wrong, and because I wanted to know the truth. And now that you know it, now that I know it, I have two things to tell you." He paused. "The first is that you have grounds to contest your exile formally before the merchant court. The documentation is sufficient. The witnesses are willing. If you wish to pursue it, I have the contacts to facilitate it." She waited. "The second thing," he said, "is of a different nature." She waited again. Outside, the cold storage foundation was being built, stone by stone, in the frozen ground. Inside, Peter had sensed something in the quality of the silence, and had made himself very busy inspecting the goods on the back shelves. "I have not said something before now because I do not say things before I am certain of them," Evander said. "I am now certain." He looked at her without looking away, and there was nothing performative in it. No attempt to manage how it appeared. No calculation of effect. "I would like to marry you." The room did not make a sound. "Not as a political arrangement," he continued. "Not from obligation or convenience. I have thought about this since I left Vorheim in February. I have spent 3 weeks in Aldenmere being reasonably sure and the journey back here becoming certain. I am 34 years old. I have been married once before, in a way that was useful to other people and of limited value to me. I am not interested in repeating it. I am interested in—" He paused, and for the first time she saw something that was not control in his expression. Something slightly unguarded. The way a man looks when he is saying something true, that he has said to no one before. "I am interested in you. In who you are. Not in a situation I can shape, not in someone who will be managed, but in a person I have observed over a number of weeks to be someone I respect entirely." Mara looked at him. She did not look away. She was not the kind of person who looked away from things. "You are giving me a great deal to think about," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not asking for an answer now. I am asking for an honest consideration." "Then I have 3 conditions," she said, "before I consider it seriously." He nodded once. He had, she noticed, not looked surprised. She began to speak. There were 3 conditions. The first, she would not leave Vorheim until the cold storage was finished and the trade post's accounts were in a state that Peter could manage without her. That meant at minimum 3 more months. She had started something here, and she would not leave it half-built. Evander agreed immediately. The second, within any marriage, her financial authority over her own affairs would be explicitly documented. She had spent enough of her life having her competence treated as a convenience rather than a fact, and she was not willing to step from one situation into another where what she knew and what she could do was managed by someone else's name. He agreed to this too, without hesitation. The third condition was different in kind from the first 2. "I will not return to Aldenmere society on anyone's schedule but my own," she said. "Not to please your family's associations, not to manage perceptions, not because the timing is convenient for some occasion. When I go back to that city it will be because I have decided I am ready, and I will decide what I am ready for." She was watching him when she said it, because this was the one she expected him to push on. The first 2 were practical. This one was personal. And in her experience, it was the personal conditions that men with authority were least comfortable agreeing to, because they required them to acknowledge that another person's interior was not their territory. Evander looked at her for a long moment. "Those are reasonable," he said. "All 3. She studied him. She was looking for the place where the agreement would soften, where he would begin to qualify it, where the word reasonable would become a hedge that he planned to trim later. She did not find it. "You are not going to argue about the third one?" she said. "Why would I?" he said. "It is your decision. It was always your decision. I am not in the business of taking that from people." She was quiet again. Not the quiet of uncertainty, the quiet of a person who is looking at something and seeing it for what it is. She thought about Aldenmere, about the house she had grown up in, and the city that had held her in a shape that was not quite her own shape, and her father's voice saying as long as necessary, as though the timing of her life was his to determine. She thought about Cecilia's letter on the shelf under the counter, and the 10 minutes at a party that had somehow been enough to send a person to the frozen edge of the world. And then she thought about Vorheim, about Bart's grin. About Clara the healer and the Holst family and old Peter, who had called her competent for the first time 3 weeks ago and immediately changed the subject because he was not, apparently, a man who was comfortable with emotion. She thought about the stone foundation going in outside the window, and the ledgers she had filled with her own handwriting, and the months of cold and work and difficulty that had somehow, without her planning it, made her more herself than she had ever been. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "Please," he said. "I am not agreeing because of the merchant court case. I am not agreeing because of the title, or the position, or what it would mean in Aldenmere. If those are your assumptions about my reasoning, you should say so now." "They are not," he said. "Then what are your assumptions?" He looked at her steadily. "That you are a person who makes decisions based on evidence and honest judgment. That you will tell me if I am wrong about something. That if you agree, it will be because you have decided it is the right thing, not because I have constructed a situation in which it is your best available option." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. It was not quite a yes, and they both knew it. But it was not a no, and it was the beginning of something that had, she was beginning to see, been building since February, since a man had walked into the back room of a trade post, and looked at her ledgers, and asked good questions, and listened to the answers, and had not once, in all the days that followed, looked at her competence, as if it were something that needed to be managed or reduced. She held out her hand, he shook it, formally, and there was something almost funny about it. Two people sealing the beginning of the most significant conversation of their lives, with the same gesture they would have used to close a trade agreement. But it was also exactly right. Neither of them was a person who wanted performance in the place of something real. "I have a question," she said. "Ask it." "The inquiries in Aldenmere. The witnesses. Helen from the household. How did you find her?" "She found me," he said. "Or rather, she found someone who led her to me. She had been wanting to speak for some time. She simply needed someone in a position to act on what she knew. And now? Now there is a record. Whether you choose to act on it formally is your decision. I have made no moves without telling you." She nodded. It was, she thought, a very precise way to treat someone, to gather information that might be useful to them, and then set it in their hands rather than use it yourself. It required a kind of patience and restraint that she had not associated with powerful men in her experience. She was still revising her associations. The cold storage was finished by mid-spring. It went up, stone by stone, at the pace that real things are built, slower than you want and faster than you feared, and solid when it was done. Mara walked through it the afternoon it was completed, her breath visible in the cool interior, her hand running along the stone wall. She had been corresponding with Evander through the months, practical letters mostly, about the territorial figures in the supply route adjustment, which had been formally approved and would take effect in autumn. But the letters had also become something else, slowly, in the way that correspondence between two careful people becomes something else when they stop being careful, when they trust that the other person will not misread a sentence that is slightly more personal than the last one. She had sent him a description of the cold storage foundation the day it was laid. He had sent back a description of a meeting in Aldenmere that had not gone well, written with a dry precision that had made her laugh out loud and made Peter look up from his chair in alarm. She had written back. He had written back. It had continued. She finished the trade post accounts in the second week of spring and sat with Peter to go through them. He understood them now, not perfectly, but well enough. She had been teaching him, quietly, throughout the winter, not as a formal arrangement but as the natural overflow of working alongside someone who was paying attention. He would need help eventually, but he had someone in mind, a young man from the settlement named Owen, who had been helping with the post's supply receiving, and who had a natural gift for figures that he had not yet had the chance to develop. Mara spent a week teaching Owen what he needed to know to start. He was a quick learner. She left him with 3 pages of clear notes and a standing offer to write to her if he encountered something he could not work out. On the day she packed her travel bag to leave Vorheim, Bart appeared at the door of the trade post with a crate. "What is that?" she asked. "Going away gift," he said. "From all of us. Open it when you get there." She looked at the crate. It was heavy, she could tell by the way he was holding it, and something inside shifted when he set it on the counter. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "We know," Bart said. "That's why we did it." Clara came by to say goodbye, and the Holst family, and old Marta Greer with a scarf she had knitted in a pattern Mara had admired once in passing, the kind of gift that could only come from someone who had been paying attention. Peter shook her hand at the door. He held it for a moment. "You came here and fixed something I had given up on," he said. "You let me," she said. "That mattered." He nodded. He was not a man for more words than necessary, and she respected that. She turned and walked to where her horse, a much better horse than the one she had arrived on, purchased with her own carefully saved coins over the winter, was waiting. She did not look back at the road to Aldenmere as she rode. She looked at the ridge, still white at the top with snow that would not fully melt until summer, and at the sky above it, which was the pale, clear blue of a season turning, and at the road ahead of her, which led to Norfeld first, and then, eventually, to wherever she decided she was going. Evander met her at the border of his territory, which was not something she had expected, and which she noted without comment, because she had found that the things she appreciated most about him were often the things she had least expected. They rode into Norfeld together. He showed her the estate, a large, solid building set in a valley between two forested ridges, less grand than its reputation but more functional, which suited her entirely. He showed her the estate accounts, because of course he did, and she found 2 inefficiencies within the first hour that he took careful note of, and then she put the books down and they went for a walk along the ridge path before the light failed. "Are you still deciding?" he asked. "No," she said. "I decided in March. I wanted to see Norfeld first." He looked at her. And it suits me," she said. "The accounts are manageable. The estate staff seem competent. The ridge path is good." Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. Brief and real and more valuable, she had learned, than the sustained performances other people called warmth. "I am glad the ridge path meets your standards," he said. They were married in Vorheim. That was her choice, and he agreed to it without argument. The chapel at the edge of the settlement, with Clara and Bart and the Holst family and old Marta and Peter, who wore his best coat and looked uncomfortable and proud in equal measure. There was no grand announcement in Aldenmere. There was no society event. There was a small ceremony in a stone chapel at the edge of the known world, on a morning when the sky was the exact pale blue of a season turning, and 2 people said what they meant and meant what they said, and that was all. The crate Bart had given her, opened that night in the small room at the back of the trade post where she had slept through the winter, contained a carved wooden plaque with the words Vorheim Trade Post, rebuilt, a jar of the medicinal moss that had started everything, and a letter signed by every family in the settlement that said, in the plain language of people who worked with their hands, that she had made a difference, and they had not forgotten it. She folded the letter and kept it. The return to Aldenmere came in the autumn, on her own terms and in her own time, as she had said it would. She came as the Duchess of Norfeld, which was a title that entered rooms before she did, and arranged people's expressions in interesting ways before she had said a single word. She came with Evander, who had the particular gift of standing next to powerful statements without making them himself, and she came with a clarity about herself that no one could take from her, because it had been built in the cold and the dark and the difficult, built out of her own work and her own choices, and it did not depend on anyone else's approval to hold its shape. Her father attended the formal reception they held at the capital's guild house. He was older. He looked at her across the room with the expression of a man who is trying to calculate the distance between who he expected someone to become and who they actually are, and finding that the distance is larger than he had planned for. She walked across the room to meet him. She was not unkind. She was not warm. She was honest, which was the only thing she had ever wanted to be with him, and had never quite been allowed. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. They talked for a few minutes. She asked about the household. He asked about Norfeld. He did not mention Cecilia. She did not raise it. When they had said enough, she excused herself and moved on, and she did not feel the weight of it the way she had expected to. Cecilia was in the room, across the space of it, standing near a window. Mara saw her, and held her gaze for a moment. Cecilia looked away first. That was enough. The merchant court case was resolved 2 months later, quietly and in her favor. She did not attend the hearing. She sent a representative with the documentation and received the formal record correction by post. She read it once and filed it, and did not think about it again. What she thought about was Vorheim. She and Evander returned in their first winter together, because she had said they would, and because it was where things had started, and because places that have shaped you deserve to be returned to with gratitude. The cold storage stood solid and full. Owen had the accounts in good order. Peter looked 5 years younger than he had when she arrived. She did not say so, but she thought it. The ridge above the settlement was white with the first real snow of the season, and the sky was that particular northern gray that she had learned to find beautiful, because it did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. She and Evander walked the ridge path on the second morning. "Every year?" he asked. "Every year," she said. He nodded. He did not question it. He had never questioned the things that mattered to her, and she had found, over the months of building something real between them, that this was not indifference. It was a very specific form of respect, the kind that does not confuse love with control. She stood at the edge of the ridge, looking out over the settlement below, at the trade post with its new sign, repainted, the letters clear, and at the cold storage beside it, and at the smoke from the chimneys rising in thin, steady columns against the gray sky. She had been sent here to disappear. She had arrived with a travel bag, 50 coins, and the particular determination of a person who has been told who they are not and decided, quietly and without fanfare, to find out who they actually are. What she found, in the cold and the dark and the work of it, was that she was someone who could build things, not just accounts and supply routes and stone foundations, but trust, the real kind, earned slowly, from people who had no reason to give it, except that she had given them a reason. She had found a man who saw her without needing her to be smaller. She had found a settlement that needed her, and said so plainly. She had found herself, which was the thing she had not known she was looking for until she found it. Below her, the settlement of Vorheim moved through its morning. Smoke rose, people moved between buildings. A dog crossed the open space between the trade post and the chapel at a steady trot, going about its own important business. Evander stood beside her on the ridge path, looking out at the same view. Neither of them said anything for a while. They did not need to. They had learned, between them, the particular value of silence that is not absence but presence. Two people standing in the same place and seeing it together. "Ready?" he said eventually. "Yes," she said. They turned and walked back down into Vorheim, into the cold and the smoke and the solid, real, continuing life that was waiting for them there. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything.